Shadows in the snow. Winter in Alaska was as harsh as nature itself. It took one's breath away with its biting cold, fierce storms that raced through the mountains, slicing the wind's edge across frozen rivers and ice-covered trees. Anyone who had ever ventured here understood why this area was called the Forgotten Land, a place that seemed to turn into an otherworldly realm, where not only people vanished, but entire groups disappeared. The legends about this place were numerous and terrifying, but they did not scare the brave skiers who sought out new extreme routes. Max, Sarah, Alice, and Jack were just like that. They all dreamed of dangerous slopes, mysterious mountains, and untouched snowy expanses. They heard about this place from acquaintances who had also attempted to conquer the vast mountain ranges, only to leave behind a few photos from picnics in the worst parts of the region. It was in these remote, closed-off areas that they planned to conduct their winter expedition. Their guide was a local instructor, an old man named Graham. His face was weathered, and his eyes were so cold that his gaze carried an air of anxiety, as if he had long known all the horrors that the legends spoke of. He warned them that the distance to their destination would take longer than they thought, and if the weather turned, they might end up stuck in the mountains until the spring thaw. His words sounded like a curse. "Don't try to change the weather. Remember, the snow here does what it wants," he said as the group set off on their journey. At first, everything was perfect. The snow covering the slopes was soft and powdery, not icy, which allowed them to ski without much difficulty. They laughed, joked, and marveled at the view. Max and Jack even built a snow fortress, hiding inside for a brief moment to pelt each other with snowballs. But the further they went into the mountains, the more hostile and dark nature became. Nightfall came earlier than they expected, and Graham suggested stopping at an old hunting cabin a few miles off their route. It was a simple wooden building with 2 floors, and there was not a soul in sight nearby. "Don't be afraid. This place isn't dangerous, as long as you're careful," Graham said. But even his words seemed more like reassurance for himself than for them. That night in the cabin, they heard sounds coming from the basement. At first, it was faint footsteps, like the sound of snow rustling underfoot. Then, when they asked Graham about it, he just waved it off. "Bad weather," he muttered, taking a few sips from his cup. But when the group discovered tracks on the floor, as though someone had walked through and left wet traces of snow, almost melted, fear began to spread among the skiers. These were not the tracks of their boots, but something heavier and more tangible. They decided to go down to the basement to see what had happened. There, they found an old mirror. A mirror that seemed out of place in the building, broken, but no one remembered when it had shattered. Nothing happened. Just shadows that lingered around the house. And one, the shadow that lay on the snow, rising as if it were alive. Max discovered that one of the links in his ski equipment was broken, and he would have to stay behind to repair it. Sarah, Jack, and Alice continued on, leaving him with Graham. They had no idea how quickly darkness would fall. When Max found himself alone, strange things began happening to him. A strong wind began to blow down the mountain, making the snow fly up beneath his feet, covering everything around him. And every time he looked around, it seemed as though someone was watching him. Shadows moved between the trees, and someone was very close. And in his heart, strange voices echoed, voices from the past. Meanwhile, Jack, Alice, and Sarah, barely making it through the storm, reached a familiar spot on the mountain where they were supposed to reach the next waypoint. But instead of discovering something new, they found themselves trapped, just like Max Hell began. The shadows moving between the trees quickly turned into terrifying creatures, growing ever more real. Since leaving Max, they had all begun to notice that they were not alone. They were surrounded by feelings of being pressed in from all sides. And only when they reached the threshold of an old mountain monastery did they understand that this part of the world was not just a part of the earth. This was a place cursed by unknown forces, and their attempts to escape only led to futility. These mountains are not just mountains. They are older than us. And they demand sacrifices, Graham said, already trembling with fear. They all vanished, leaving only frozen tracks in the snow, never taking their eyes off this cursed place, which had forever frozen their souls, turning them into part of the very landscape. Other skiers who came here heard their sounds, and became part of the same horrific trap, forever frozen in the cold world of the mountains. Graham stood before the doors of the old monastery, his hands barely holding the lantern, whose flickering light could barely reveal what lay ahead. He no longer looked like the man he once was. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, and even his weak voice sounded as if he was speaking not for them, but for himself. "This place, it's not just a place, it's a trap for souls," he muttered, inhaling deeply, as if trying to protect himself from what was coming. "You think we can get out? Ridiculous. Everyone who has come here never returned. And if you want to know why I'm here, it's because I was one of their captives too. I became one of them." Alice froze for a moment, listening to his words. What did he mean? Weren't they all still alive? She and Jack exchanged looks, their faces silent, their bodies already exhausted, their minds entangled in fear. Was it worth continuing? "We can't stop," Alice said softly, her voice trembling from the cold, but she spoke with resolve. "We have to find Max, and maybe we can get out of here." But even these words couldn't distract them from what was happening around them. The longer they stayed in these mountains, the more they understood they were not alone. As they neared the monastery, the intensity of the wind increased, as if nature itself were trying to push them away from this cursed land. Graham began to chuckle softly. It was a dreadful, marble-like sound that resonated with the silence around them. He turned away from them, and that's when they realized he didn't want to go inside. "You have to go on your own. They are waiting for you," he whispered. Alice stepped forward, her heart pounding at her chest, and the shadows behind her grew larger, like dark clouds moving on the horizon. Jack followed her, but with every step, he felt it becoming harder to breathe. As soon as they entered the monastery, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and decay, as if the place hadn't been visited in years. The interior walls of the monastery were covered with ancient symbols that seemed familiar. Their shapes were frightening, but they couldn't look away. It was too quiet here, unnervingly quiet, and that was the scariest part. Shadows in the corners of the rooms seemed to move as if coming to life with every one of their motions. "What is this place?" Jack asked, but his voice faded into the soft hum that enveloped the monastery walls. "And what if we don't get out?" Alice asked silently, though the question seemed meaningless. There was no answer. Only then did Graham seem to reach his limit. He stood at the threshold, unable to cross the old trees that stood before the monastery like an impassable wall. He turned around and said, "Their eyes are everywhere. They're already around you. Don't go any further." Alice and Jack, ignoring his warnings, continued to move forward. With each step, the world around them began to feel more and more irrational, like a parallel world. They walked through corridors where the shadows swayed ominously, and old, rusted doors that seemed to lead into another dimension. "Graham, we have to do something," Alice shouted, her voice sharp but no longer confident. She tried to keep herself together, knowing that if she lost hope, everything would be lost. Yet with every word, it became clear she didn't believe it herself. She already felt how the space around them was shrinking, and time was ceasing to exist. Graham simply looked at her, but his eyes no longer belonged to him. They were trapped. The candlelight disappeared, and in the darkness, sounds began vibrating that had no explanation. They were like whispers, touching their bodies with invisible hands. They turned, trying to understand where the sound was coming from, but couldn't. It was everywhere, and it echoed in their heads. Suddenly, everything went silent, and then they heard voices from the past. These were the same people who had never returned from these mountains, their souls trapped here forever. Alice began to see figures moving fluidly and silently in the dark. They were getting closer. These were dead, frozen bodies that only came to life when their souls could return to their bodies. They moved, but their bodies were empty shells, frozen in the past. "They've returned," Jack whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Alice stood in shock, unsure of what to do. She couldn't move, but she understood one thing. She couldn't leave this place. And though she wanted to escape, their path was blocked. Her gaze changed, and from the darkness, other faces appeared. A sinister laugh followed. The shadows that had been haunting them from the very beginning were now real. At that moment, they understood. Their fight was lost. They had become part of this endless, cold, and dark story, frozen in the snow, in a place where there was no hope of rescue anymore. Alice felt her heart tighten, and the sense of reality began to blur as her gaze briefly lingered on the face of one of the dead. It was not human, cold, tightly covered in hardened skin, as if from forgotten times long past. Yet it wasn't just a face. It was on the boundary between the world of the living and the dead. Its eyes did not shine, but they were deep, as if hiding a dark abyss within, beckoning. "We shouldn't be here," Alice whispered, feeling her body grow cold, the chill slowly penetrating every cell. She felt as if every thought, every movement, every word was vanishing into this endless darkness. It was as if the entire world no longer existed except for this crypt, where their souls were slowly freezing. And when she looked at Jack, she saw how fear began to flood his face. His eyes reflected nothing but shadows. She understood. Jack had also begun to realize that this wasn't just darkness. It was something much more terrifying. "What is this?" Jack's voice was barely a whisper, but there was nothing human about it. It was fear, tightening around their throats, narrowing the world to a tiny space. And at that moment, they were overtaken by an incredible sensation. The shadows that once merely lingered in the darkness were now becoming part of the space itself. They began to move. At first, it was just light movement, like the wind brushing past their bodies, but gradually these movements became more distinct. They blended with the darkness, constantly closing in on their prey. "They want us to stay," Graham finally said, turning back to them. His voice was distorted by the terror he was trying to control. He stood there, his face looking older and more worn than before. "But we can't stay here," Alice exclaimed. She turned around, realizing that every step they took only brought them closer to an endless sacrifice that was bound to happen. She grabbed Jack's hand and pulled him toward the door, but something stopped them. A dark figure appeared before them. "This isn't just a mountain monastery, it's a portal," Graham said, staring at the monumental figure, which emanated cold stronger than any frost. His hands began to shake, and his gaze was empty, as if he no longer saw them but only those eternal shadows. "They're waiting for us to become part of this." Alice couldn't accept this. How could it be true? How could an ordinary monastery be a portal to a world where time and space no longer mattered? She began to tremble, feeling her breath tighten. She couldn't go back, couldn't stand still, and couldn't even look away. The shadows around her left her no choice. With a dull sound, the monastery doors slammed shut, and for a brief moment, the silence shattered into pieces. Everything that was behind them remained in the darkness. Far behind them, it seemed that footsteps were approaching. It wasn't just an echo. It was the very essence of what was beginning to awaken in the endless dark. "You won't be able to escape," Graham said, as if he had already lost all hope. "This place holds you in its trap. And you're not the only ones here." Suddenly, a clanking noise echoed. It was the chains stretching from the walls, connecting them to this world, creating a new cycle. And as soon as the clanking stopped, there was an immediate pause. But only for them to realize there was nothing that could save them now. The shadows became real. They began to stretch their hands from the darkness, enveloping Alice and Jack. They had no faces, no voices, but they felt the fear that pushed them to the edge. The forces that had brought them here now seized every cell of their bodies. They had become part of this world, and nothing could change this true reality. "You can't escape from yourself," a voice echoed, familiar yet cold. It was Max's voice. Alice turned her head, trying to understand where he was. But his face no longer existed in the form she remembered. It was an empty shell, filled with shadows. He was neither alive nor dead. He was part of this endless cycle, a victim who never left the monastery. "Max, what happened to you?" Alice shouted, but she already knew the answer. It was something she didn't want to know. "I can't leave." "Neither can you," Max said, his voice ragged, like a rusty string resonating in the dark. "It's not a choice. It's something we have to endure." And then Alice realized they weren't just trapped in this place. They had become part of something much older and more terrifying. This was the endless line of those who, like them, had tried to leave these mountains but could never truly escape. They were locked in a cycle of shadows that could not be defeated, and anyone who entered here became part of this cursed nature. All those people had become one of the dead, and their souls remained here forever, unable to move forward. And as new skiers, tourists, and adventurers continued to arrive in these frozen mountains, they didn't realize that those who had been here before them would be waiting, once again, to take their souls, frozen in the snow, once and for all. The shadows around them became increasingly real, and with every movement, these invisible creatures drew closer to their new victims. Alice and Jack, not even attempting to escape, felt the fear wrap around them from all sides. Every effort to understand where they were and what to do next seemed meaningless. They were no longer just people. They had become part of this dreadful, forgotten world where the laws of nature no longer applied. "We won't get out," Graham mumbled, feeling the shadows mercilessly consume him. He stood as if frozen, as if he had already become part of this nightmare. This was their game, and now we are theirs. Alice tried to hold back the tears filling her eyes, but it was futile. She understood. What awaited them was the same fate that had befallen all those who had once dared to cross the threshold of this cursed monastery. "Graham, we have to do something," Alice shouted, her voice sharp but no longer confident. She tried to keep herself together, knowing that if she lost hope, everything would be lost. Yet with every word, it became clear she didn't believe it herself. She already felt how the space around them was shrinking, and time was ceasing to exist. Graham simply looked at her, but his eyes no longer belonged to him. He had become something greater, something more broken than just a man. The last trace of his former life was fading from his face. They could see it. His body moved, but his soul had already been claimed by these dark creatures, who lived in this world and took everyone who stepped inside. Alice and Jack felt the shadows close in around them from all sides, like black hands weaving out of the void, reaching their legs and pulling them deeper into the abyss. The walls of the monastery began to squeeze, and all the paths that had once been open for escape were now blocked, like frozen doors to the darkness. They were trapped, with no way out. "There's no choice," Jack whispered, his voice barely cutting through the terror. "This is the end." Meanwhile, strange sounds began echoing in the rooms of the monastery. Weak moans, whispers that quickly grew louder and intertwined with muffled thuds. They couldn't understand where these sounds were coming from, but they felt the cold wrap around their bodies. A cold that certainly wasn't natural. It was a sensation rising from the depths of the earth, something not of this reality. And as the shadows drew closer to Alice and Jack, they felt the last warmth slip away from them. They were no longer human. They had become part of this terrible force that took their souls. Alice could no longer hold herself together. Her legs buckled, and she began to fall into the darkness. In that moment, when she was embraced by the shadow, she understood this was only the beginning. Whatever they did, it didn't matter. She felt how the darkness consumed her, sinking her into nothingness. But even in the darkness, she could still hear voices. They were strangely familiar, as if from another life. These were the same voices that once echoed in her head when she was still among the living. Max, his voice began to sound dull, merciless, and cold. "You should have known this," he said. "It always ends this way." Alice couldn't tell if it was really Max or just another part of this nightmare. But now, nothing mattered. All their attempts to survive, all their hopes and dreams, had been consumed in the fire of this invisible world, just like the bodies that were now being enveloped by the shadows. The shadows began to drain the last of their strength, washing away all memories and turning them into emptiness. And when Alice felt her consciousness slowly fading, she understood one thing. No one could escape from here. Everyone who entered this place became part of these deadly cycles. And she was already frozen in this endless story. But what happened next could not be described with words. At the moment when the shadows consumed the last fragment of her consciousness, she felt her hand touch another. It was a hand that held hers in the darkness, and she knew she was not alone. It was Max's hand. Alice felt him, but at the same time, she realized that none of them were alive anymore. They were now part of this eternal frozen world, an endless void that consumed every soul that entered. And yes, when they returned home, they were no longer human. They had become part of what awaited everyone who tried to escape this death. And every new tourist who appeared in these mountains would become the same. Their souls remained in these mountains, in this monastery, frozen in the snow, and only time knew how many others like them would try to find a way to salvation. But it was in vain. For in the end, they had already become part of this endless darkness that waits for anyone brave enough to step inside. And it would go on forever,